Tadhg stood for a lot more than just the nationalist movement or just the GAA. Like, he stood for the ideals of socialism, of inclusion, and of raising the standards of particularly those who were less well off within Cork City.
When I became aware of him, I became aware of him as a hero.
This was a young man who epitomised the Irish Revolution, epitomised everything about it. It wasn't just for freedom, it was actually about the Irish spirit and who the Irish were and what they were going to be.
For a man who was totally involved in the IRA, in the GAA, in the Irish Transport and General Workers Union, it's difficult and hard to see how he managed to rear 3 children that weren't his.
Without the likes of him, without the fight that Tadhg put up against the merchant princes, foreign occupiers, we wouldn't have what we have today.
I suppose the extent to which he represented a tendency within the independence movement that wanted to bring it to the left, that wanted to not just change the colour of the flag or the colour of the post boxes, but actually transform social and economic relations.
He probably suspected that he would end up either dead, in jail, or exiled. That was the most realistic end result for his activities.
So Tadhg was born in Blarney Street on the north side of Cork City in 1880. Same year as Charles Stewart Parnell was elected MP actually for Cork. So it was into that context of the parliamentary party, Parnellism and all that he was born really and grew up. His father was a cooper, skilled trade at the time. So, they were quite well off relative in working class terms.
Like, there was a big family of them there, and they all seemed to have disappeared. There was 8 of them in the family.
And he attended, unlike many of his peers, I suppose, he attended both primary and secondary education. Primary in Blarney Street, National School, and secondary in the North Mon, which is a famous, of course, nursery of many revolutionaries like McCurtain and McSweeney and so on, who were very close to Tadhg and would have been his contemporaries.
And he was also very much involved with the church on Sunday as well. He was an altar boy on Sunday as well. Tadhg Barry was my granduncle. My grandmother, Mary Barry, who married Matthew Galvin, was his older sister. My grandmother, Mary Galvin, married and had 3 children. And when her youngest child, my father, was a year old, her husband emigrated to America. After her husband emigrated, she moved back into the family home in Blarney Street and lived with Tadhg and Paddy.
And my father's mother, who was Tadhg Barry's sister, died when my dad was 7, and Molly and Danny were young as well.
She died quite young, and he was left then in the care of Tadhg and Paddy Barry, and he reared them, which was marvellous when you think about it in those days, particularly with his involvement in the other stuff.
My mother Molly and Eddie and Danny were reared by Tadhg, and in doing so he educated them. They brought them to a stage whereby they were able to go out into the world and earn their living and rear families themselves.
But after leaving school, he got a job in the nearby asylum, as it was called then, Eglinton Asylum, Our Ladies, the mental hospital, as an attendant, which would now be a sort of psychiatric nurse, I suppose. And that was a very good job at the time, and a lot of people in that area would have worked in the asylum. It was a massive economic boon to the area. And he spent a number of years there from about 1899 to 1903, I think. And I think he was active there in the Asylum Workers Union, which was his first taste of trade union politics.
The city at the time would have had a lot of heavy industry. It also would have had a lot of unemployment and a lot of poverty. There was a significant portion of the population living in pretty much extreme distress and poverty. There were tenements. There was a lot of sense that the city and the country could be doing better than it was.
When we're talking about Ireland in Cork in the turn of the 20th century, I think the important thing to remember is that Ireland was an integral part of the United Kingdom at that time, and Cork was one of the main cities of the United Kingdom. So in that respect, I think Cork was predominantly a loyalist town. I mean, there was a lot of loyalty towards the monarchy and the whole concept of a United Kingdom at the time.
His first entry into journalism, I think, was with a little magazine or a journal called The Cork Accent, which was set up by William O'Brien, the MP, the Cork MP in 1910. And it was called The Cork Accent because O'Brien split away from the Irish Parliamentary Party led by John Redmond. And the reason it was called The Cork Accent is because O'Brien and his supporters were blocked from speaking at the Irish Party convention. And somebody said that nobody with a Cork accent is allowed to speak. So that's the reason, on that basis, basically, because anyone with a Cork accent would have been an O'Brien supporter who would have been an opponent of the leadership of the party at that time.
Cork was divided politically between the Redmondites, led by John Redmond, the Irish Party, nationalists, and William O'Brien's All for Ireland League, which would have been a little more socially progressive, but would have had very similar attitudes about the national question. And those two parties were very much in violent conflict in Cork City. There were faction fights pretty much between party activists and leaders. The general elections were a mess, and Cork was infamous for this very violent and bloody social and political division. And Barry gravitated towards a kind of a Republican movement that was very much in the incubation stage. It was small, it was marginalized, it wasn't very important.
And soon after 1910, O'Brien established a daily newspaper called the Cork Free Press, and that was a direct competitor to the Cork Examiner, which was a Redmondite paper, in other words, the enemy in that sense. And he started writing, he became a staff writer on that around 1910, 1911, and he was mainly concerned with GAA affairs. He wrote under the pen name on Tadhg, the left-hander or the lefty or whatever way you want to call it. And I think that was very important in terms of popularising the GAA in Cork in particular, because, as Tadhg himself said, the Cork Examiner was full of Union Jackery and covered the foreign sports, which were rugby and soccer and cricket and so on. And he had a fierce antipathy towards both the Examiner, the Redmondites, and the foreign sports.
Tadhg Barry's work as a journalist was vital in this whole era. He wrote weekly columns in the Cork Sportsman, and the Cork Sportsman was a paper that gave great coverage to local sporting affairs, particularly GAA affairs. I suppose the GAA, after it was founded, had a great period where it blossomed for 5 or 6 years, and then it was going quite well up to the time of the Parnell split.
It was really only in the first decade of the 20th century that the GAA had its socks pulled up, really, and Cork played a big part in that.
Tadhg Barry would have been involved in the background at that time. He had obviously met up with the likes of J.J. Walsh and Sean O'Hagerty, and they were very interested in all things Irish and all things cultural and all things political about Ireland, and they joined an array of associations in which developed things, and one of those would have been the GAA.
J.J. Walsh, who was a comrade of Tadhg's, he led a team that included Tadhg Barry in revolutionising the GAA in terms of its organisation, its administration.
One of the first things they did was they introduced turnstiles at championship matches, and this made a huge difference to the resources of the Cork County Board. All of a sudden they had money that was beyond their wildest dreams. Behind that as well, Tadhg Barry had other interests, and he could see that it was quite important to get everybody involved in the GAA or the GAA movement. Camogie started in Dublin in 1905, and very shortly it moved to Cork, and Tadhg Barry was instrumental in setting up the first team. The team was called Fáinne Lé. Tadhg Barry was their coach, I suppose, and their teacher, and he got the girls together.
He wrote, of course, the first book on the rules of hurling and how to play it, which was published in 1916, the first book of its kind. He was also involved as a delegate in various, he was very, very prominent in the colleges and schools competitions, of course, and went on to become the Harty Cup.
When there was the battle for the hearts and minds of the North Mon school, where the Mon had been a rugby school, and Tadhg Barry in particular would have found this very hard to take, because he was from the Sundayswell area. He would have gone to school in the mine himself, and he would have seen seen it as an anathema that a Christian Brothers school would not be promoting Gaelic games and all things that were Gaelic in that way.
Of course, he was delighted when his own school, the North Mon, turned, I suppose, away from rugby in 1916, I think, or around that period, and became a pure GAA school.
He was massive in the Cork GAA, rebuilding the Cork GAA. He understood this as a vehicle to get in contact with people and their interests. When you have a hard enough life and sport is a relief for you, he understood that that's where he could get to talk to them.
With the foundation of the Gaelic League and the cultural revival, a group of activists kind of formed, a small group, and they had a Republican ethos, Republican outlook, and they went into a whole bunch of different areas. And Barry was part of the core member of this group. They would have been involved in stuff like the Gaelic League, they would have been involved in the GAA, they would have been involved in amateur dramatics with Daniel Corkery. They also started a political party, Sinn Féin.
The original Sinn Féin that set up in Cork, it was established in Cork in 1906, and Tadhg Barry was his first secretary. So it was a small group, very much not the Sinn Féin that emerged after the 1916 Rising as the sort of powerful force that won the 1918 election. A small group, of course, centred around Arthur Griffith and his ideas of self-reliance and autonomy for Ireland, and very much pushing Irish industry, Irish manufacture, Irish self-reliance, as the name implies.
They also initiated the Fianna Éireann, and they were preparing quietly for possible physical resistance to British rule.
So it was very much swimming against the tide for these characters like Tadhg Barry, Terence McSweeney, Sean O'Hagerty, Liam de Rochta, Liam Rochelle, Tomás McCurtain, people whose names become very familiar subsequently, but at the time very small. Now, there was a whole interlink and overlapping sort of network of organisations that they were involved in.
It was a small group, but it was a dynamic group. They had picnics, they had dances. It was a chance to meet girls in a time when in a socially conservative period. And the group had a heavy brain power. There were a lot of impressive characters that came out of it. A lot of national figures came out of it.
So there was a whole plethora really of organisations, the Ancient Order of Hibernians, American Alliance, and I suppose significantly the secret organisation then that was maybe pulling a lot of strings in the background that Tadhg was a member of, the Irish Republican Brotherhood, the IRB, or the Fenians, who of course were very prominent subsequently in sort of influencing the course of events in the Irish Revolution.
Then, of course, in 1912, we had the introduction of the Home Rule crisis. This changed Irish politics forever. In 1913, then, we had the introduction of the Ulster Volunteer Force in the north of the country.
To resist, basically, the imposition of Home Rule, as they regarded it. In response, in Dublin, the Irish Volunteers were formed, basically to sort of defend Home Rule, if you like, and to kind of vindicate and assert Irish national rights and Ireland's right to some form of independence. In Cork then in late 1913 the Cork Corps of the Volunteers was established, and Tadhg Barry was at the founding meeting in the City Hall.
Hundreds of people signed volunteer forms and enrolled formally into the Irish Volunteers.
Of course they had to buy their own uniforms, they had to get their own weapons and so on, and it's funny in retrospect seeing ads in the newspapers, for example, for guns and uniforms, and get your volunteer uniform from this tailor or that tailor, badges and so on. So they all dressed themselves, essentially. And really, the volunteers at that stage were seen as a bit of a joke, kind of toy soldiers, chocolate soldiers, in their own uniforms, marching up and down, playing soldier, if you like. And a lot of people regarded, the fight in the trenches, if you like, the First War as real soldiering, and this was really silly stuff. So there was quite a lot of abuse thrown at them and so on.
And it should be remembered, when the Cork Corps of Volunteers were established, these men were basically forming a military organisation out of nothing. The only thing they had was their vision. So what they had to do then, over the coming weeks, they had to establish, set up administration, training, secure locations to conduct their training, put an organisation in place and elect the leadership.
Tadhg became an officer quite quickly, and they established themselves in Shear Street eventually, a volunteer hall there.
This was a pivotal move for Barry. It now put him in the heart of the decision-making process of the Cork Corps.
With the outbreak of the First World War in 1914, there was a split in the volunteers. John Redmond led basically the majority to support the British war effort in the hope of ensuring that the British would deliver home rule. Tadhg remained with the minority of the volunteers, who were very much IRB dominated. They opposed obviously any involvement in British war, and thought that Irish soldiers should fight for Ireland. And it was those volunteers that went on to become the core participants in the 1916 Rising and subsequently in the War of Independence.
Getting past the split with Redmond, basically when the First World War started, most of Cork supported the war effort. Thousands joined the British forces. Many more people served in the British Army than ever served in the IRA. Many more people died fighting in the First World War than died in the War of Independence.
After the split, the establishment supported the National Volunteers. They got weapons, they got uniform, they got funding. The Irish Volunteers, on the other hand, had nothing.
That being said, the Irish Volunteers were a small group, but they grew. And basically they threatened physical resistance to any imposition of conscription into Ireland. And though the British government introduced conscription to Great Britain in January 1916, they didn't introduce it to Ireland because they anticipated physical resistance from the Irish Volunteers. And as the months went on and the war continued to go poorly, and fear of conscription rose, more and more people joined the Irish Volunteers. So by Easter 1916, you would have had about 200 members in the city and about 1,000, 1,500 members in the county. And that would have been probably the best organized and the best armed in the country outside of Dublin.
Of course, there were those within the leadership of the Irish Volunteer movement at that time, after the split, who felt that the organisation could be used to achieve an independent Irish Republic by force of arms. These were members of the Irish Republican Brotherhood, and in May 1915 they formed a secret council to plan for an armed rebellion that would establish the republic that they dreamed of, as I said, by force of arms.
In the plans for the Easter Rising in 1916, the role of the Cork Brigade was to join units from Kerry and Limerick along the Cork-Kerry border to receive their quota of weapons, which they were to have been landed in Kerry on Easter Sunday. And it was Tadhg who led the city company as the flag bearer. The weapons never arrived because of the armed ship was intercepted and scuttled, and the brigade was stood down amidst confusion and anger and contradictory orders from Dublin.
McSweeney subsequently described it very well when he said, order, counter-order and disorder.
So the end result was that Cork didn't participate in the Rising, and the volunteer leadership, McCurtain, McSweeney and Tadhg and the others, occupied the volunteer hall in Shear Street. And it was extremely difficult for them to know what to do, given that the British at that stage had surrounded the hall effectively and surrounded the city, and were basically threatening to bombard both the hall and other parts of the city if the volunteers took any action.
A deal was eventually negotiated between the Lord Mayor, the British authorities and Bishop Collin here in Cork, whereby the volunteers would surrender their weapons into the safekeeping of the Lord Mayor, T.C. Butterfield at the time, and in return the British military and police authorities gave an undertaking that they wouldn't be harassed or arrested or anything like that. The following Monday, the volunteers, or the vast majority, not all of them, because the decision wasn't made lightly. There was a hardcore element, Tadhg Barry included, who thought this was ridiculous, that they should hold on to their weapons, that they would be needed in the future. The vast majority of volunteers actually handed over their weapons to the Lord Mayor. Unfortunately, the following morning, the British Army broke the agreement and the weapons were seized, and a whole series of arrests started taking place here throughout the city and county as part of the nationwide crackdown on the volunteer movement in the wake of the rebellion.
So following the Easter Rising in 1916, where James Connolly and Pádraig Pearse and Tom Clark led the fight against the British on the streets of Dublin, the English, of course, executed the leaders, and the swell of support that came from the Irish people fed directly into the Sinn Féin movement, set up originally in 1905, of course, by Arthur Griffiths. By 1917 and 1918, had become a national revolution. These were people that were demanding Irish independence and demanding national self-determination. And the time had come now for the Irish to prove to the British that they would no longer be a colony in the British Empire.
Different groups that were still retained their cohesion, like in Cork, reorganized after the uprising, and Tadhg Barry was a central participant in that, and was basically the central organizer in the months after the Easter Rising in Cork City and County, and he helped put together back the movement nationally.
The advanced nationalist movement really was transformed, and Sinn Féin was transformed into really a kind of a national front or a national coalition of radical nationalists. And it was kind of a two-headed dual strategy, with the Irish Volunteers on one side, who were reorganised and eventually become the IRA, and Sinn Féin on the other side. And Barry was involved. Barry moved more from the volunteer military side into the political side, really come 1917, 18, even though he was still, he was still a volunteer and he was still marching and so on. He was mainly making what the British called seditious speeches and so on and so forth in that period. So he moved then into the Sinn Féin political side. Late 1917, he attended the famous Mansion House conference of Sinn Féin when De Valera was elected head of both the Volunteers and Sinn Féin in October 1917. And the situation in 1918 really was transformative. The threat of conscription, extending conscription, where Irish people would be forced into the British Army, was looming. There was an extremely serious food crisis, and there was a People's Food Committee established in Cork that Barry was involved in. So there's lots of things happening in the background that fed into the continuing support for the radicals. Sinn Féin then, with the war looking like it would end as 1918 went on, Sinn Féin were in a very powerful position, and the British tried to hobble their advance really, and tried to undermine their credibility and undermine their leadership by arresting 73 leading members, including Griffith and De Valera, across the country in the so-called German plot arrests. It was essentially a cobbled up conspiracy theory that they were involved in planning another rising with the Germans. So they were rounded up and interned on a very spurious basis, and Tadhg Barry was one of only 2 in County Cork who were lifted in that particular swoop, and the only one in the city. So he was sent to prison in Wales and subsequently in England until the middle of 1919. While he was in jail, the whole political situation changed. The war ends, the general election is held in December 1918, and Sinn Féin sweep the boards across most of Ireland, across nationalist Ireland at least. They established Dáil Éireann as a cessationist parliament in January 1919, and it's into this transformed political landscape that Tadhg is released then in early 1919, and he becomes a full-time trade union official, but he also becomes active again in the Sinn Féin movement.
Well, the Irish Transport and General Workers Union was founded officially on the 4th of January 1909 by Big Jim Larkin. And Big Jim had a row with the union, the National Union at Dock Labourers, which was a British-based union. And he decided that an Irish-based union was required.
Tadhg Barry would have been very supportive of the idea of an Irish union. One of the key things about the Irish Transport and General Workers Union, not just that it opened up trade unionism to general workers, dockers and general labourers, etc., but also that it was a specifically Irish union.
Tenement living was the order of the day for workers, very lengthy hours of work, very low pay, no sick pay, no pensions. It really was a very, very bleak period for workers and their families. And the likes of Connolly and Larkin came along. They founded the Irish Transport and General Workers Union, and notwithstanding the efforts of the employers to defeat the Transport Union, it actually survived. And from the period after the Rising, 1917, up to around 1919, 1920, it went from a membership of about 5,000 to over 100,000 in that short number of years. So you can see the connection it had in terms of workers, the fight for improving pay and conditions and protecting jobs, but also the connection with the establishment of the state itself.
IT, basically, the Transport Workers Union in Cork, became part of a coalition with Sinn Féin and with the IRA and with Cumann na mBan. And they basically created kind of an industrial action component of the revolutionary movement. Basically, you had British armed ships and ships bringing British Army reinforcements standing idle for weeks because the dockers wouldn't touch them. The railway workers wouldn't raise the drawbridges to allow them up the river. Once they were offloaded by their own soldiers, they couldn't be carried on trains because train workers refused to carry them. And that munition strike, as we call it, went on for 6 to 7 months before it was finally broken.
On his release from prison in 1919, he was actually appointed full-time organiser to the agriculture workers section, which happened to grow to be one of the biggest sections in the union at the time, 50,000 strong. And from there he was elected full-time branch secretary to the Cork No. 1 branch, which is the James Connolly Memorial branch.
Tadhg Barry was instrumental. He was involved with Connolly, bringing Connolly to Cork, was present for Connolly addressing 2 meetings here.
He would have been a great follower of James Connolly's ideals. He would have been a great supporter of him and the cause of Labour and the cause of Ireland. He would not have seen them as different.
He was involved with Jim Larkin, actually Jim Larkin coming to Cork. Tadhg again was very much instrumental in that. He was involved in welcoming the Congress of Trade Unions here to the city. I think the big thing was his work as an organiser for the union, helping to organise particularly the rural workers, farm labourers, and that was they didn't actually have the modern transport that we have today. So you can imagine going out on the highways and the byways that time, mostly on push bikes, and trying to organise workers into a union.
Making them understand that alone they can be picked off, but to unite together in a strong voice is their option.
For the most part, Republicans saw Labour as a potential, they wanted to keep them on side. They didn't want Labour to get in their way or to cause a division in the national momentum and national movement. Barry saw Labour as a crucial element and as a way of pushing forward the entire Republican agenda. So he saw Labour in a bit of a different way. And the important thing about Barry as a figure is he was in the political sphere as a public official, he was in the military sphere as an organizer of the IRA, and he was in the labor sphere as a union organizer. And he basically melded all 3 of those into one person. And that was why there was kind of a dynamic element to him.
So the War of Independence really hotted up in the summer of 1920, and that's when the whole situation militarised very strongly. Barry wasn't involved in the military side at this stage. He was very much the trade unionist. He was involved in very significant strikes and campaigns across County Cork and Munster. It was fascinating, really. The red flags were flying all across rural Munster and rural Cork at that time, and the slogans of international socialism and Bolshevism were being proclaimed, which is hard for us to imagine now. So there was almost another under the radar of the kind of conventional idea of fighting the Black and Tans and fighting the British and all of that. There was this other almost class-based social revolutionary situation developing, and Barry was trying to straddle the 2 of them in some ways.
In Cork, in the municipal elections in 1920, the ITGWU and Sinn Féin ran a joint ticket, and councillors were elected to basically representing Republican workers, kind of a Republican Socialist Party, if you will.
And these were the famous elections where, again, Sinn Féin copper fastened its political dominance, I suppose, in nationalist Ireland. It's when McCurtain and McSweeney were elected to Cork Corporation, and Tadhg Barry was elected as an alderman on Cork Corporation as well, and he voted for Tomás McCurtain as the first Republican mayor of Cork, of course, and the Cork Corporation pledged its allegiance to the Revolutionary Parliament, Dáil Éireann, and the tricolour was flown over Cork City Hall. And Tadhg Barry was very much part of that revolution, as they called it in public administration in Cork, where they basically sort of cleaned up a lot of the corruption and jobbery that had been dominating that particular sector, and he was very much part of that sort of radical cleaning out, I suppose, of local government at that time.
He also understood you must be heard where decisions are made, so he sat on various committees, especially the dwelling for the working class, the allotments committee, the waterworks committee, things like that. And when you look at that, he was looking out for the housing for the working class, making sure allotments were given out fairly, that they could grow their own food. At the same time, he was campaigning at national level within his organisations for workers' rights.
While Cork would have been quiet during 1919, all that would change in 1920. In January 1920, the Cork Brigade of Irish Volunteers organised a synchronised attack on two RIC barracks, one of which, Carrigtwohill, was captured, becoming the first actually RIC barracks to fall into the hands of the Irish Volunteers, which by then were known as the Irish Republican Army.
And this was due to a real impatience among Cork volunteers. They felt they'd let down Dublin in 1916, and they were very eager to kind of redeem themselves. So in January 1920, an IRA offensive started.
Of course, the British and the RIC didn't take this hands down. And in March 1920, they struck back in a dramatic fashion. In the early hours of the morning of the 20th of March, a group of RIC men, masked, in civilian clothing, beat down the door of the home of Thomas McCurtain in Blackpool, pushed his wife aside when she answered, rushed upstairs and shot McCurtain, who was then Lord Mayor and officer commanding the Cork Brigade of the IRA. They shot him dead in front of his young children and his wife. This had a huge impact on the volunteer force at the time. Here was their very commanding officer shot dead on his doorstep. And it changed the nature of the conflict. McCurtain's funeral presented the Cork Brigade of the IRA with an opportunity to bury their commanding officer with full military honours, and they did so.
After McCurtain died, Sean O'Hegarty took over command of the IRA in Cork City, and he escalated resistance and violent resistance. And a number of barracks were attacked in the city and in the area around the city. There were a number of assassinations, and the general temperature went up significantly.
The campaign that the IRA were waging against the RIC was indeed having the desired effect. Numbers were dwindling, and recruits could not be found within Ireland to join the force. The Black and Tans are often perceived as a separate force, but they weren't. They were just British recruits for the Royal Irish Constabulary. But when they came over here to Ireland, there wasn't enough police uniform to go around. So they were clad in a mixture of British military khaki and the dark green, very, very dark green of the RIC, and some inspired with, named them the Black and Tans, after a very famous pack of greyhounds in County Tipperary. Unfortunately, it soon became evident that the Black and Tans failed to have desired effect on the IRA. They proved to be ill-disciplined and ineffective, and far from driving people away from the IRA, they were pretty much driving people into the ranks of the IRA.
There was a lot of public support for the movement in general in Cork. But the leaders were young, they were of a lower social class than kind of the city establishment, and there was an aura of gunsmoke around them.
McSweeney was McCurtain's successor, both as Lord Mayor of Cork and indeed as commanding officer of Cork No. 1 Brigade of the Irish Republican Army. McSweeney was arrested in the 12th of August 1920, taken up to Victoria Barracks, court-martialed on charges of sedition, and sentenced to 2 years imprisonment in Brixton Prison. And it was there, as we all know, that on the 25th of October 1920, he passed away after 74 days on hunger strike. So Cork was now in the eye of the storm. In the space of a few months, the city had lost 2 Lord Mayors, who were both commanding officers of the Irish Republican Army. The Black and Tans had arrived, and they were going out their business in a particularly bad way. And in August, we had the auxiliary division of the Royal Irish Constabulary starting to arrive in Ireland. The first unit was deployed in Macroom.
And they seem to have been responsible for a dramatic upsurge in reprisals. And in the weeks leading up to early December 1920, you had Sinn Féin meeting halls around the city burned down, a number of Republican businesses burned down, grenades thrown into businesses, and basically during curfew at night, it was a very dangerous place with troops basically in black and tans basically firing into the air, firing at civilians. A number of civilians were killed on the street. People were run down by lorries. It became a very, very scary place. And with the assassination of McCurtain, Sinn Féin public officials were threatened with assassination by members of the Crown Forces, and members like Tadhg Barry had to go on the run, couldn't sleep at home because they were afraid of being shot in their homes by members of the Crown Forces. So Barry was basically a fugitive for the entire year.
Martial law was declared on the 10th of December, and on the following night, a unit from Cork No. 1 Brigade ambushed 2 lorry loads of auxiliaries at Dillon's Cross, just a couple of hundred yards away from Victoria Barracks, wounding 11 and killing 1. For the auxiliaries in the barracks, this was more or less the last straw. And at 9 o'clock that night, they stormed out of Victoria Barracks down to Dillon's Cross and proceeded to set fire to, I think it was about 9 or 10 houses and burn them to the ground. A half hour later, a unit of auxiliaries from the barracks went down into the city centre, aided and abetted by members of the Black and Tans, and proceeded to burn more or less the city centre. They burned Roach's stores, caches, a whole range of shops located in the city centre. It was a horrific night. It was the greatest single act of arson committed in Ireland ever. When the fire brigade attempted to put out the fires, they were hampered and harassed by members of the Crown Forces. Overnight, over 2,000 people were put out of work. £15 million of damage was done by the forces of the Crown, and without a doubt, it changed the loyalty or the outlook of the people of Cork who might have been harbouring one bit of loyalty to the Crown when they saw what the forces of what were supposed to be upholding law and order were capable of doing to their city.
Meanwhile, the corporation and Tadhg Barry were, getting on with business, trying to run the city, trying to run the markets, trying to run the various institutions, keep the parks open, keep the roads running. While simultaneously Barry was involved in radical social action with the trade union movement and so on. So by the time the British, by late 1920, the British had decided really to up the ante, and part of their campaign to undermine the strengthening Sinn Féin and IRA and radical nationalist movement was mass internment, and they rounded up thousands of people.
For people like Tadhg Barry, who had this public role as elected officials, they were out in the open. They were exposed. The IRA were unknown fugitives, but the elected officials had to go to City Hall and meet. They had to go and appear in public. And it was very, very dodgy for them. It wasn't just a question of getting arrested and going to jail. It was a matter of, you might just be pulled out and shot by the Black and Tans, who had made it clear that they were going to take physical reprisals on leading Republicans.
The Republican Corporation, including Tadhg, gathered in Cork Courthouse in January 1921 to re-elect O'Callaghan as Lord Mayor of Cork. The British forces arrived, the police arrived, surrounded the chamber and had the names of 9 councillors, of 11 actually, but there was 9 present, including Tadhg Barry. The names are called out and they were all arrested. No charge, no crime committed. It was absolute, it was just pure emergency powers internment. They were taken to Cork Barracks, then they were taken to Cork Jail, subsequently to Spike Island internment camp, and after virtually 3 weeks put on a steamship and brought to County Down, to Ballykinler internment camp in County Down.
Niall, what do you think the conditions were when my great-uncle Tadhg Barry was in internee in Ballykinler camp?
Well, originally the conditions had been quite bad, but by the time Tadhg arrived in the camp was mid-February 1921, and at that stage, like the camp, in terms of organisation, the men were very well organised at this stage. But again, the actual condition within the compound was really marshy ground, it was boggy, it was damp, it was cold. You had that wind and rain almost constantly. So it was really bad, like for people who would have had, say, suffered from asthma. They would have suffered a lot. And then the other extreme then was like in the good weather, the dry weather, you had sand because the wind was almost a constant thing. Like again, the food was atrocious. The men couldn't survive on the food, and their survival was basically the parcels that were sent from home.
So Ballykinler there was two camps of about 1,000 in each, I think. It was full of famous people that would become famous. Sean Lemass, future Taoiseach of Ireland, of course. Peadar Carney, the author of the national anthem, Oran Navian. Joe McGrath, founder of the Irish Sweepstakes. Loads of TDs who'd been elected to the Dáil Éireann, councillors, leading trade unionists. A whole range, a full spectrum really of people who had been involved in the War of Independence and the fight against British rule in Ireland, and Tadhg Barry among them. It was a kind of a classic prisoner of war camp type situation, where there were huts, the prisoners were kept in huts.
And we're actually standing here in front of one of the huts that was actually used in Ballykinler to house the internees. And the hut itself would have held up to 25 men. And there were 4 rows of 10 huts in each compound. And majority were occupied by internees, while others were used for laundry, washroom, post office, and there was also a punishment hut.
There was quite tight discipline on the outside, but basically internally the prisoners sort of ran the camp themselves. They had their own police force, their own censors, they had their own money, which they printed, their own currency. They had their own library. They had something like 12 different GAA teams within the camp, so they had massive competitions. They had bands of various sorts. They had sort of chess clubs. The elected representatives met separately. So Barry was so the TDs who were in there met separately. Barry was amongst the councillors or the aldermen who met as well. And Barry himself, in fact, established a trades council in the camp, which, as far as I know, is the only one of its kind, where he brought together all the active trade unionists who were in the camp and organised themselves, and then made contact with the trade union movement outside so that moral and financial and other support could be offered by the trade unions to the prisoners inside.
The policy of internment is to demoralise, is to break the spirit. So to take hundreds and hundreds of men is to break that aspiration. And the way the men actually dealt with it, they organised education, they organised sports, they organised any activity that was to almost stop the monotony, the rot that the internment was there to instill. And Tadhg Barry was at the centre of every activity within the number 2 compound. He was very much involved in a debating society. He was very much involved in the GAA. He was involved in practically everything, and he was writing lectures every week.
Apparently he was extremely popular according to all the accounts. He was in the old man's hut, being 40, with other older members.
They had their newsletters. It was Na Backlash was in the number 1 compound, and then in the number 2 compound where Tadhg was situated, you had Barbed Wire, and they often had contributors, with jokes, stories, and all in good humour. There was never ever even a serious situation on the outside would have been made a joke of. And this year was their weekly read, and they were sold, I think it was for two shillings.
He reported on the GAA games, so it was the last hurrah, the swan song of on Tadhg in Ballykinler camp.
Tadhg was an Irish teacher and taught classes and presented certificates within the camp number 2 in Ballykinler. And it's people like Tadhg preserved the language and actually promoted it. And as a result, the language probably now is as strong as it ever has been.
on May Day, or Labour Day, 1921, he organised just the most fantastic series of events along with his Trades Council comrades, which really again sort of showed the extent to which Tadhg Barry was attempting to infuse Sinn Féin policy and infuse the Irish independence struggle with the ideas of socialism, with the ideas of the rights of labour, with the ideas of social justice, and with the idea that labour ultimately would push to the front and create a workers' republic, which is what he fought for and what he believed in.
And the day started off kind of comically because the British were basically opposed to the labour movement, and they basically gave the permission to hold the day on the agreement that no red flags had been flying anywhere in the camp. And of course there was the jokers among the internees. There was anything with red was put up, underwear, shirts, everything.
So there was red flags flying all across the camp on May Day, red rags to John Bull, as he described it, because it drove the camp authorities mad, and every time they pulled down a red flag, another one went up. Even those who weren't socialists, began wearing red ribbons. What he did was he combined in the various events and lectures the sort of nationalist Irish Ireland elements, along with the old Celtic Bealtaine festival elements of sort of carnivalesque, dressing up and all of that sort of stuff, with serious socialist messages, with emblems and flags, with the singing of the red flag, along with our own Navian and so on.
The 15th of November 1921 was a Tuesday, and on that morning the British Commandant, Colonel Brown, announced that 30 men were to be released, and that was made up of 15 men from each compound, which is the men referred to them as cages. And these announcements actually, they would have created a lot of excitement, because men would have gathered to find out who the names were, and when the names were actually called out, men would have been sending messages home and things like that. So it created a lot of excitement, a real buzz about the camp.
In November 1921, negotiations were ongoing in London. Griffith and Collins and the other Irish negotiators negotiating with the British government. And as part of the background to that, a factor in those negotiations that was put forward by the Irish was what they called the hostages that the British were keeping, and the hostages were basically the internees, thousands of them across the country, including Tadhg Barry and Ballykinler. So as part of the negotiations, an agreement was made to introduce parole, temporary parole for the prisoners, as a precursor to the general releases that would occur once an agreement was signed. So just 3 weeks before the signing of the Anglo-Irish Treaty, the first prisoners for Ballykinler, a couple of dozen of them were going off on parole, including a number from Cork. There was maybe 40 or more gathered at the fence to see off the departees, to see the parole people heading off. Messages were being shouted, it was all good spirits. Tadhg was among a group at the fence. There had been an escape attempt quite recently, and the British were quite nervous that nothing go wrong with this parole thing, that it wouldn't be taken advantage of. Now, the IRA was quite clear about that as well, and they ordered everyone who went on parole to make sure they came back. They didn't want anything to upset the apple cart. So there was really no danger of anything happening, probably, really. But as I say, the British were nervous, and orders were given to the various sentries and the guards to be on the lookout for any shenanigans, for any carry-on.
Tadhg Barry was actually standing on a bucket. He turned it upside down because he tried to peer over a galvanised steel fence to wave goodbye to his comrades. And a young sentry, an 18-year-old sentry, was in the box, not say 20 yards from him, and he had shouted an order for him to get down and for the men to stand back from the wire. But Tadhg Barry refused initially, but then when one of his colleagues or his comrades actually encouraged him, he said he was getting down.
As he turned, Barrett, the sentry, opened fire, shot him directly through the heart, and killed him instantly. And there was absolute shock and horror descended on the camp. All the reports are really striking in the sense of the absolute horror of the sudden crack of the rifle, the sudden sense of that something tragic had happened. And Barry died instantly, shot through the heart. So his blood, as one of the accounts says, it watered the sands of Ballykinler. Loads of his fellow internees started pouring out of the huts and running towards the area where it happened. A number of them took handkerchiefs and dipped it in his blood and held it up to the sentries and to the guards and said, shoot us too, shoot us too. The camp, it looked like things would get out of hand, so the camp chaplain and the sort of IRA officer in charge organised the prisoners to say the rosary. So that sort of calmed matters down.
Initially the inquest was held on the 18th of November, and it was held in the camp with the only witness being Patrick Barry, Tadhg Barry's brother, and he basically gave evidence of identification, and the inquest then was adjourned. And it was opened and adjourned on several other occasions, and it didn't actually resume until January 1922. And at that stage, the camp had been cleared, all internees were released, so there were very few witnesses among the internees, and several turned up and gave evidence. And basically the inquest was a whitewash.
What's striking really, and from all the accounts, is how the nature of his death affected everybody, and of course the timing of his death. The fact that 3 weeks later, basically the gates were thrown open and all the internees were released. The fact that Barry, as one person put it, like somebody who would have willingly stood alone against a battery of enemy guns, was shot down in such a cruel and pointless way, defenceless, unarmed. And it's really striking the extent to which it had an effect, not just on the internees, but on nationalist Ireland and on the Republican movement and on the Labour movement across Ireland in general. It's absolutely astonishing, the national reaction that occurred.
On the occasion of his funeral, as the funeral was about to leave the camp, a British soldier went to pull the tricolour off his coffin, and an officer reprimanded him and told him to leave that flag on, that man was a soldier. And the flag subsequently stayed on his coffin all the way through the north, into Dundalk and all the way to Cork.
The funeral began in Ballykinler, obviously, and then went by road to Dublin. And all along the route, for example in Drogheda and Dundalk and in Newry and all the towns that passed through, thousands of people turned out, workers laid down their tools for the day. There was, tributes all along the route to Dublin, and eventually when the cortege reached Dublin, many TDs, public representatives, went out the road basically to accompany the cortege into Dublin. The descriptions in the media of the day, in the newspapers of Dublin that night are just astonishing. I mean, some newspapers say 200,000 people were actually on the streets. I mean, might be a bit of an exaggeration, but it was obviously incredible, really, the numbers and all the organisations that turned out. It was the last full mobilisation of the IRA, for example, in Dublin. Over 5,000 IRA volunteers mobilised before the split over the Civil War. Common Amman, led by Constance Markovich, all the trade unions, the labour movement, all of Dáil Éireann, the whole churches, everything. They went to Pro Cathedral. And the following day, Michael Collins returned from London from the treaty negotiations, and he accompanied Barry's remains to the train station, as did many other TDs. And the footage we have from the Pathé newsreel of Barry's last journey is very striking, to see the kind of who's who of Republican leaders following his coffin, including Collins, W.T. Cosgrave, who would have been on the pro-treaty side very soon of the treaty split in the Civil War, along with Harry Boland, Cathal Brugha, and many of those who would have been on the anti-treaty side.
Barry died within a couple weeks of that entire movement shattering, being broken apart by the divisions of this treaty. And it's, in a way, it's the death knell of the revolution.
The body was then brought to Cork, back to his home place, and again the scenes are astonishing. The crowds that were out, the whole city closed down. Everything was basically all workers down tools. There was no sporting events. All the trams stopped, and so on and so forth. And there was a huge funeral presided over by the Bishop of Cork, Bishop Collin. The funeral itself took about 2 hours to pass one given point as it made its way out the next day to St Finbarr's cemetery.
His funeral procession was led by the volunteer pipe band. Members of the Cork Brigade of Irish Volunteers marched alongside him, accompanied him on that last sad journey, and when his coffin was placed into its grave, his comrades from Cork No. 1 Brigade of the Irish Volunteers, men who he had served side by side with in so many difficult times, stepped forward, drew their revolvers and fired a volley of shots over his grave in one final salute to a fellow soldier.
Sean O'Hagerty, the head of the Cork IRA, gave the oration at Barry's grave, somebody who had trained the Fianna, for example, the youth, with Barry way back a decade before at the beginning, really. And in his speech he said that Barry was buried with McCurtain and McSweeney in the Republican plot in St Finbarrs. He said they were all martyrs and they will never be forgotten. Now, McCurtain and McSweeney have been rightly remembered and celebrated in their native city, but Tadhg Barry, for whatever reason, was forgotten for many years. I mean, some people have kept the flame alive and some people remembered in the trade union movement and so on, and members of his family. But in general terms, it's incredible the extent to which somebody whose funeral and whose death was such a national event, for somebody who was so prominent in such a range of areas, that he could be so quickly forgotten.
Well, I suppose it is important to remember the people that went before, and I know there's a group of houses called Tadhg Barry Place up off Cathedral Road, and I remember my father being very proud at the time when those houses were named after him, because it was kind of the only recognition really. And I think there's a room in Connolly Hall as well named after him, and I know that my parents were invited to that at that time, Well, I think we need to appreciate the struggle that went in to build the country really, and I suppose it's easy for them to be forgotten,
Well, I think it's a shame that his memory was forgotten. I think possibly because he died just before the state was established. So perhaps if he had lived longer, he might have entered into politics, because he didn't have immediate descendants. Like he wasn't married, and I think that there was no immediate family to keep his memory alive. I also think that there was a sort of revisionism in history where we didn't recognise the sacrifices that were made by people like Tadhg.
Well, I believe from a worker's point of view, there is an agenda out there to airbrush out our contribution to building this nation.
It really is a travesty in terms of the contribution that he made to the city, to the country, to the labour movement itself, and indeed to the value system that we try to promote. And for that reason, I really sincerely hope that his memory and the work that he pioneered can be brought back to the fore, that it can be brought into our schools, that the city itself will celebrate the richness of his contribution.
Looking back on the life and times of Tadhg Barry, I think I could say he was in many respects a man for all seasons. He was a man who believed that Ireland would be a better place outside the British Empire. He was a man who believed in an Irish Ireland. He was a man with a great sense of social justice. He was a leading trade unionist, he was a journalist, he was a sportsman and a leading member of the Gaelic Athletic Association. But he was also a soldier who was prepared to put his life on the line for his belief, for his vision of an independent Irish Republic. And indeed, he did lay down his life for that vision. He did lay down his life for the independent Irish Republic that he dreamed of.
So Tadhg Barry was a part of a remarkable generation, really, in terms of the revolution that they carried out, from very small beginnings as a tiny minority within the city of Cork, within Ireland generally. They basically came to power in most of Ireland and managed to, defeat effectively, or partially defeat at least, the most powerful empire on earth.
What I like about Tadhg Barry is he was really funny. He had a really good sense of humor, and he had a real warmth about him. And he was popular within all elements of the movement, not just because of his political leanings, because of who he was personally. He always appealed to people's kind of best side, and he cheered people up just through this kind of absurd sense of humor he had and this kind of inner warmth that he shared.
So he was a community man, a trade unionist and a political leader, a journalist, a poet and a scholar, an amazing man.
And we're delighted within our club and proud that our pitch here has been named Memorial Park in memory of Tadhg Barry. He was a man of integrity that fought for Irish liberty, for the establishment of Gaelic games, for the promotion of the Irish language, for the labour movement. All of those ideals are still absolutely relevant today.
Well, Tadhg Barry's idea was never go away, and in the state Ireland is in today, they should be looking to people like Tadhg Barry and his idealistic view of the labour movement and of socialism to pull us out of the hole we've got into.
The level of equality, the level of social justice, the actual level of sovereignty and control over our own affairs that exists in Ireland today would really not be what Tadhg Barry gave his life for, effectively.
I'd say he would be horrified with some of the developments politically over the past number of years.
Tadhg always fought for the have-nots and more equitable society. And if you look at where we are today, the exact same fight is going on.
I think if we had the values that Tadhg Barry and the labour movement pioneered during the Celtic Tiger years, we would never have ended up in the unmerciful mess that we have today due to the lack of regulation of the banking sector and the financial sector, the greed that was associated with developers, and all of that has left a legacy of debt on us and our children and indeed our grandchildren, which, you know, would never have occurred, never, if the values of the likes of Tadhg Barry and Connolly and Larkin had been espoused and taken on board during those periods.
When we're in this period of darkness in the country, when there's a lack of hope about the country's state, about what direction we're going in, when there seems to have been a failure of national leadership and of civic engagement, I think it's important to think about people a century ago who faced what they would have seen as very similar circumstances, but yet persevered and worked. And they worked even though it didn't seem like in the short, medium, or even long term they were going to be successful, but they still held to their ideal and then continued to work anyway. And because of that work and what they accomplished in those years, they were basically in a position when circumstances changed to take advantage of those circumstances and to push the country in a way that they felt would improve the lives not just themselves, but of future generations.